I was the preacher at Junction Pass. The summer Cal Merrick walked into my chapel on a Tuesday and asked me, with his hat in both hands, if I would marry him on a Friday to a woman he had spoken to only twice. I had buried his wife 3 winters before that, and I had baptized his boy Jonah the same week, so I knew the look on him better than I cared to. He was not a man who came inside a church if he could help it. When he did, it meant something had broken loose at his place that he could not put right with a hammer. "Reverend," he said, "I need a vow read, not a long one, Friday at noon." I asked him who the bride was. He told me. I set down my pen. Fay Tanner was the trader's daughter, Artie's Tanner's only child, and old Artie's ran the stockyard down by the spur line the way other men run a country. Fay was 28 and quiet and read books in the office at the back of the yard, and the men of Junction Pass had decided she was too educated to court and too poor to chase, because Artie's was cash-rich and land-poor. I had spoken with her once, at her mother's grave, and I had liked her. I asked Cal how he had come to it. He told me plain. Artie's Tanner had signed a delivery contract in the spring for 800 head to the Army post at Fort Eldred by the first week of September, and his own herd had come up short by half because the Verd River had run dry on his lower pastures. Artie's had ridden out to Cal's high desert place on the Mesa Blanca 2 weeks back and stood in his dooryard and said, plain as a yardman, that he could pay Cal the going price for 400 yearling steers and a long-term lease on his upper grass. And here the old man had looked past Cal at the dust track where the boy Jonah was playing with a stick. Cal could marry Fay, take the 400 head as her dowry into the joint brand. And the Tanner yard would back the barem for as long as Cal Merrick had a pulse and a son who needed a name on a deed. "And why," I said, "would that man want a son-in-law on a hard-luck Mesa instead of the cash deal?" Cal shifted his hat. "Because he's dying, Reverend. The doctor gave him a year. He wants Fay settled with a man who will outwork him, not one who will outlive him for the money. He said he watched me walk a wagon-broke filly for an hour to put her sound, and reckoned I'd treat a wife the same. I will not pretend I was easy with it. A marriage is not a stockyard contract, and I told him so. He looked at me with his quiet gray eyes and he said, 'Reverend, I asked her. I asked her at her father's office with the door open. I said, Miss Tanner, your father has put a thing to me. I will not take it unless you put it to me yourself in your own voice, and unless you tell me you are free to say no without it costing your father 1 steer. She said her father would honor either answer. She said yes. She said she would not be sold and she would not be bartered, and that if I would have her as a partner she would have me as a partner, and that the cattle were her father's gift and not her purchase price, and she would write that down on a paper and sign it before we ever stood in front of you.' He looked at me. 'She did write it. I have it in my coat. She wants you to keep a copy with the marriage record, so there is no doubt.' I took the paper. I read it. It was a clean, plain thing in her hand, signed Fay Margaret Tanner, and it said in 3 lines what he had told me in 3 minutes. I folded it and put it in my desk. I said, 'Friday at noon, then.' Friday came. She walked in on her father's arm in a sand-colored dress and a hat she had trimmed with a sprig of ocotillo, and Cal stood at the front in a pressed shirt, and the boy Jonah stood between them, 6 years old and solemn as a deacon, his hair wetted down and his small boots polished. I read the vows short. I read what they had asked me to read, to keep each other in honest work, in shared decision, in dignity, and in time, the Lord willing, in love. She said, 'I will.' He said, 'I will.' The boy reached up without anybody telling him and took her hand in his small one, and she did not flinch. She just closed her fingers around his, and old Artie's Tanner in the front pew put a fist against his mouth and held it there. I pronounced them. They walked out into the white noon light, and the stockyard sent up a long whistle on the spur line, and that was the wedding. They drove out to the Mesa Blanca that afternoon in 2 wagons, hers full of books and bedding and a sewing chest, his with the boy beside him on the box. By dark she had made up a bed for herself in the small east room that had been a tack room and was now scrubbed and lime-washed and curtained. She set that line herself. She said, in front of Cal and in front of me, I had ridden out to bless the house, as is our custom. 'We will know what we are to each other when we know, Mr. Merrick, and not a day before. The vow we took is the vow of partners.' The rest we will let arrive on its own road, or we will let it stay away, and either way the boy will have a mother who keeps her word." Cal nodded once. He said, "Mrs. Merrick." He said it like a man trying out a wagon tongue for true. She let a small smile touch her mouth for the first time that day. She said, "Faye, I will tell you what I saw in the months that followed, because I rode out to the barn most Sundays after evening service to look in on them, and because Jonah took to walking me to my horse when I left, with his small hand in mine, and a boy will tell a preacher what nobody else will hear." Faye took the ledgers and made them sing. The barn had been running on Cal's memory and a pencil stub, and inside a month she had every steer, every fence post, every barrel of nails written down in a hand a banker would weep over. She took Jonah to his letters every morning at the kitchen table for 1 hour before chores, and the boy who had not spoken above a whisper since his mother died began reading aloud to his father by lamp at night from a small blue book of frontier tales. She rode out with Cal and showed him, without making him feel small, how her father had taught her to spot a steer that would not finish on grass. She mended. She kept the gun cabinet. On Sundays she came to chapel in the same sand-colored dress with Jonah beside her, and the women of Junction Pass, who had decided she was too educated to befriend, discovered she was easier company than half of them, and shifted their pews to sit nearer. Cal, for his part, treated her as he had told her he would. He did not touch her hand except to help her down from a wagon. He did not enter the east room. He set her chair at the table at his right, and he listened when she spoke, and he stopped every evening before he ate to wait for her to begin. The boy watched all of it. The boy is the part I noticed first. Jonah began to laugh again that summer, small, startled laughs at first, the way a creek laughs when the ice first gives. He began to call her Miss Faye. By July he was calling her Faye. By the end of July he had begun, on his own, with no one prompting him, to call her Ma at the supper table, and the first time he did it, Cal's fork stopped halfway to his mouth and stayed there, and Faye set down her cup very gently and said, "Yes, son," and went on with the meal as if her heart was not breaking and mending in the same minute. Then the drought turned mean. The Mesa Blanca had not seen a true rain since April. By the first week of August, the grass on the bench had gone to wire, and the seep at Lonesome tank was running a finger wide. Cal rode the upper line every morning before light and came back at noon white around the mouth. The 400 Tanner steers had to be on the trail to Fort Eldred by the last week of August, and a thin steer brings a thin price, and a thin price would not honor the contract. Artie's Tanner came up the road one evening on a sorrel he should not have been riding, a sick man being honest about being sick, and he stood in the dooryard the way he had stood there the first time, and he said, "Cal, I have had an offer." The offer was from a man named Ott Vesper who ran the Diamond V on the flat below the mesa. Vesper had water, a long spring-fed creek he had bought up from the old Holly's place, and he had been laying out a price to old Artie's for the Tanner contract for 2 months, a low price, the price a man offers when he thinks he is the only buyer in the country. Now with the drought, Vesper had come up to half decent, and Artie's was a sick man with a daughter to settle and a yard to leave clean. Artie said, "I can take the Vesper offer and I can put the difference in trust for Faye and the boy. You take no loss. The contract goes through. You and Faye take the barn on without the Tanner steers and without me on your shoulder." Cal looked at his father-in-law a long while. Faye had come out onto the porch the way I have heard her come out 100 times since, quiet on her feet, and she put her hand on the porch post and she waited. Cal said, "Mr. Tanner, with respect, the contract was put in my name when I married your daughter. The 400 head are running on my grass. The price Ott Vesper is offering you is the price of a man who knows your time is short and means to use it. I will not have him use it. I will deliver the contract." Artie said, "The grass will not carry them, son." Cal said, "Then I will carry them." He did not look at Faye when he said it. He did not have to. She had already moved. She walked off the porch and out to the yard, and she said, "Father, ride home. Sleep. We will be down at the yard at first light to talk about water." Old Artie's Tanner looked at his daughter the way a man looks at a thing he has built and underestimated. He went home. That night Faye spread her father's plat book and Cal's pasture sketches on the kitchen table, and she worked until the lamp guttered. She found us water. She found it in 2 old hand-dug wells on a derelict quarter at the foot of the mesa, a quarter her father had taken as collateral on a debt and forgotten, and she found a route along a dry wash that would let us drive the herd to those wells every 3rd day without losing the grass between. She wrote it out in a column. She handed it to Cal across the table. She said, "It will be 18 days of hard driving instead of 8. You and the hands and I will not sleep proper in any of them. The boy will go to my father in town with Mrs. Hollies to mind him. The steers will finish. The contract will hold. The Diamond V will buy nothing of ours." Cal read the page. He looked up. He said, "Faye, you will not ride a Drought drive with me." "That is no place for a woman," she said very softly, "Mr. Merrick. I have been riding the Tanner yard since I was 9. I will ride this drive. You may welcome me on it or you may not, but I will ride it." He looked at her a long minute. Then he set down the page and he reached across the table, the first time, you understand, that he had reached for her of his own accord, and he laid his hand over hers and he said, "Welcome, then. I will not draw out the drive." They lost no steer of consequence. They watered at the forgotten wells on the 3rd day, and on the 6th, and on the 9th, and the wash held shade enough through the hot afternoons that the herd did not panic. On the 11th day Ott Vesper rode out to them with 2 of his men, and he stood his horse across the wash, and he said it was his easement now, and they would owe him a head a day to cross. Faye sat her father's bay gelding 2 lengths behind Cal, and she did not speak. Cal eased his rifle up out of the scabbard, and laid it across his saddlebow, and he said, "Mr. Vesper, the easement was filed at the county clerk's 3 nights ago in my wife's hand, and yours was the second name to be told of it. Ride off." Vesper rode off. The drive came in to Fort Eldred on the 18th day at the strength of 811 head, and the quartermaster paid the contract in full, and Cal Merrick laid the bank draft on his father-in-law's desk himself, and old Artie's Tanner sat down in his office chair and cried like a tired man who has been told he may set a thing down. They came home on a Wednesday. Jonah ran out of the chapel where Mrs. Hollies had brought him to wait for them, and he ran straight past his father and into Faye's arms, and she went down on her knees in the dust and held him there for so long that I had to look away. That night Faye fell ill. Trail fever, the doctor called it, exhaustion and a cough and a hard fever at sundown. Cal sat by her in the east room for 5 nights. I sat with him the first 2. He read to her from her own small blue book, the one she had been reading to Jonah, and when he came to the place where a hard man kneels in the cold and prays over a small horse, his voice closed up and he stopped. Faye opened her eyes. She said, "Cal." It was the first time. He said, "Faye," she said, "I did not marry you for the contract." He tried to smile. He said, "I did not marry you for the 400 head. She closed her eyes. She said, "Good, we are agreed." On the 5th night the fever broke. He came out to me on the porch in the small hours, and he stood with his hands on the rail, and he said, "Reverend, I have loved one woman in my life. I am about to love 2. Tell me how a man does that." I said, "Cal, you do not stop loving the first. You make room. The good Lord made the heart big enough." He stood a long while. He said very low, "I have room." Old Artie's Tanner died in October, peaceful in his daughter's house, with Jonah reading the 23rd Psalm to him in a clear, small voice. He left the stockyard to Faye and a long letter to Cal that I am not at liberty to share, but I will tell you it began, son. The Bar M and the Tanner yard ran as one brand from that winter on, and they ran clean, because Faye Merrick kept the books and Cal Merrick kept the cattle, and Jonah Merrick grew up between them and went for a veterinary at the Territorial College and came home and put his shingle out at Junction Pass, and is the man you call now if your horse is foundering. I married Cal and Faye a second time in the spring of '88 in our chapel with the boy standing up for them both, because Faye said a vow taken first as a partnership ought to be taken second as a love, and Cal said he was not going to argue with the only person in the territory who had ever outthought him. She wore the same sand-colored dress. He wore the same shirt. The chapel was full. I read the long vows that time, and they meant them, and when I pronounced them man and wife, Jonah let out a small clear, there, from the front pew that the whole town heard, and we laughed the way a town laughs when something has finally come right. I am an old preacher now. I have married a great many people in Junction Pass, and I have buried a fair number of them, And I have learned that the marriages that hold are not always the ones that began in fire. Some of them begin in a stockyard office over a contract, with a careful young woman writing 3 lines in her own hand to make sure she is not being purchased, and a quiet rancher tipping his hat and asking her in his own voice if she will have him. Some of them begin with a boy reaching up and taking a stranger's hand. Some of them begin with a drought and a wash in a forgotten well, and the long ride home. What I will tell you, if you sit with me on the chapel step of a Sunday evening, is this: the Lord does not always send love through a window the way the song singers say. Sometimes he sends it walking up your road in plain dress with a folded paper in its glove, asking only for a fair partnership and the dignity to earn the rest. And if a man has the sense to say yes, and the patience to let the heart come along behind in its own slow time, he will look up one day at a kitchen table on the Mesa Blanca and see a woman writing in her clean hand by lamplight, with a boy at her elbow learning his letters, and he will know that the bargain he signed under a white noon was the truest vow of his life, and that the Lord had been writing it for him long before he ever knew to ask. That is the marriage I tell the young couples about. A bargain plainly made, a dignity plainly kept, a partnership plainly worked, and the love, when it came home like a tired man in from a long drive, knowing the door and finding it open.